Hello and welcome to everyone listening to the Written Melanin Podcast, the place where you come to get your weekly dose of melanated creativity. I'm your host, CM Lockhart, an author of fantasy books featuring Black girls who aren't all that nice, and the owner of the Melanin Library, an online database of books written by Black authors. And in this space, I invite you to listen to the journeys of Black authors as they navigate all routes of publishing. I'm glad you're here. And today, you guys, I am here with Krystal Marquis. She happily spends most of her time in libraries and used bookstores. She studied biology at Boston College and University of Connecticut and now works as an environmental health and safety manager for an online retailer. A lifelong reader, Krystal began researching and writing on a dare to complete the NaNoWriMo challenge, resulting in the first partial draft of The Davenports. When not writing or planning trips to local bookstores to discover her next favorite romance, Krystal enjoys hiking, expanding her shoe collection, and plotting ways to create her own Jurassic Park. It is so good to have you on the podcast, Krystal. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here.
I'm glad to have you. So, for those who are unfamiliar with you, how would you introduce yourself in your own words?
Hello, everyone. My name is Krystal Marquis. I am a big reader and science nerd, as you can tell by my bio and the Jurassic Park portion. I started writing on a dare, and I really enjoy great storytelling. And I think that writing is a great outlet to connect with people. And I'm very excited to talk about my books with you guys today.
Absolutely. So let's just go ahead and jump right into this. You said that you started writing off of a dare. Like, how did that come about? That's usually not most people's origin stories.
Yes. So I have a brother who is also a big reader and a writer. And I was in a reading slump and complaining about it probably too much around the house. And he was like, well, if you can't find the story, then you just write it. And that kind of got my gears going. And I was like, okay, I really want to read a romance with Black girls at the center, have it be full of joy and happiness and like something historical fiction that, I also enjoyed other historical fiction that I picked up from my mom. And he was getting ready to do the NaNoWriMo challenge. And he's like, do this with me. It'll be great. And that's kind of how I got into writing. And the story of the Davenports was written a few challenges later. But it was just something that really got me in the habit of writing every day. And I got to meet so many wonderful people in the chat rooms and just people who just love stories. And I think that was the biggest thing for me is that I really enjoy following characters on their journeys and like learning with them. And yeah, that's how it started. It was a challenge like, hey, do this with me. I bet you can't do it. That first year, I was very surprised that I completed it. Other years were more challenging. But yeah, that year it was a X-Men Dark Angel fanfic that was set in Boston. And it was just, it was like really fun. And I was hooked after that.
I love it. I love how usually the first time you sit down and write, it's just with such reckless abandon that it's just like, I'm just going to throw everything at it. And it's so fun. But then when you come back to it later years and, you've been in the craft and you've been studying it a little bit and you've been paying attention and you're like, oh, wait, I need a plot. I need things to happen in order. Like, I need this to make a little bit more sense. That's when the true challenge kicks in. So have you done NaNoWriMo since then? I know that in 2024, it's not really a thing because of what happened. But prior to this, was that kind of like your go-to challenge to get your writing habit recalibrated, I'll say?
Yeah, I've done it a couple of times. I think I've only hit the goal like 3 times, probably done it a total of 6 or 7. But it did really help. And I think it was that even though sometimes my brother and I were apart, like not living at home with our parents, it was still something that we can check each other's progress, cheer each other on. And some of the other writers that I met through it, some have been published, some are still working. It's just a supportive community in general. And it's like it's like visiting families during the holidays. Like you might be doing other things during other times of the year, but then November comes and everybody like logs back into their account. They start chatting with each other and sharing what they're working on. So I really found that it helped get that habit of writing every day.
I love it. I love it. And I also want to touch on, the community aspect of it, because one of the things that I am huge on, always have been, always will be, is that as a writer, you really kind of do need a community of people around you, because it it gets lonely, being in
Mhm.
your room all the time, and also just knowing that other people are on their journey at the same time that you're on yours, and being able to talk to each other, bounce ideas around, and also just be like, I hate this. Why am I doing this to myself? And then have someone else also be like, I don't know, but this is what we've chosen to do. So we have to see it through. What would you say to anyone who is looking for community, especially in, I'll say, this era of 2024 in America, going into 2025 with the political situation being what it is?
Yeah. I think I agree with you at the why did I do this to myself phase. I heard someone describe it once as giving yourself homework for like the rest of your life. But
Yep.
I was always someone who enjoyed homework. So for
Not
me,
you enjoying homework.
I
I'm dead. We're not
did.
going to gloss over that. What?
I said I was a big nerd. I liked it. I like learning new things and like that accomplishment when you finish an assignment or you write an essay. I would, I legit in college one time started a 12-page paper at midnight and it was due at like 10 a.m. the next day. Finished
Oh,
it, got an A.
that's
That's how
wild.
crazy I am. But
We don't
yes,
encourage that on the podcast, by the way.
do
Time
that.
management is great.
You need sleep. You need to eat healthy.
Take
Commend
care of
it.
yourself.
Yes, self care. Put that at the top of the list. But yeah, for people entering the writing community or looking to pursue anything in writing or creativity in general, I think it is difficult to find community. And I think the hardest part is probably putting yourself out there and like saying, hey, I want to write, I want to paint, I want to dance. Because there comes a lot of judgment with doing that. But I would say
Yeah,
don't be discouraged because everyone deals with those same feelings of, is this right? Am I doing this correctly? Am I good enough? And I think that also kind of builds those relationships because you share that. And I would say
absolutely.
don't be afraid to put yourself out there and reach out to someone who might be working on something. Because I feel like I reach out to people, I've never met them, and I'm like, hey, I have a question. And they've been so gracious with their time. One thing I've noticed about writers is that they're so willing to share and provide advice and give you tools that they've learned along the way. I think that's one of the great things about the writing community.
I second that 100%, because I have what I call my author council, right? And I've talked about it on the podcast, but it's three people who I trust, like, implicitly with like my work and their judgment and like how they interact with the writing world, right? It's like they're the group chat, but they're also like the people that I'm like, hey, will you read this for me? If you say it's good, then we can move on to the next phase, right?
A group chat within
But
a group chat.
essentially. And one of the ways that this came about is because we reached out to each other. Like, one of my author counselors? Yeah, one of my counselors, I'll say. She just reached out to me on Instagram and she was like, "Hey, we write the same thing in the same genre, and I think we live in the same place. It would be cool if we could, connect sometime." And our whole friendship, and we actually have met in real life at this point and hung out and done all the in real life friendship things, but also online, because we now live in completely separate places. It's nice to have that community and to be able to build off of it and just be like, yeah, we're really in this thing together. And like you said, to have someone to ask questions, because I'm an indie author, right? I know you're traditional, but I think whatever route you go, it's always nice to have someone in your corner that you could ask questions and be like, hey, is this the same experience that you're having? Or like, how did this work for you? Am I crazy? I'm not crazy? Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you for confirming that.
Yeah. I
But
think on my tour, I went to a bunch of towns and cities that I never traveled to before, with the exception of Naperville. And it was really nice to see that authors that I'd only spoken to online come to my events. So, like, it was the first time I was meeting them in person. But, like, when you're going somewhere new and you don't know someone, just seeing a familiar face or putting a face to a login or a username was so encouraging. And I was so appreciative of that. Yes, having people to bounce off like, am I normal questions with is great. One of my events, there was an author there who talked about, she was an older lady who talked about how she used to use a typewriter and then she would have like pages of her manuscript in boxes, like hidden in her room and like under her bed, because that was just what you did. You didn't like edit online, you edited on actual paper. And I remember when I started, when I was like, okay, I think I'm going to pursue writing as a career, I had went to like an Office Max or Staples and printed out my manuscript so I can edit it. And like all the drafts are like still in manuscript boxes, just like in random places around my parents' house. And she said that, and she's like, "Well, you kids don't do that anymore. Like you guys got the newfangled technology." And I was like, "No, no, no! Like I totally did that. Like I thought I was weird for doing that. But like this is great to know that like there are other authors do that." And she's like, "Oh no, yeah, we always used to do that back in the day." And it's just like that validation and like instant like camaraderie that comes out of it is wonderful.
Let's talk about your process
Mhm.
because I know we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but you still have, I'll say, a very analog process considering that most people are very much do it all online, right? So take us through your process from like having an idea to, okay, we have a finished book ready to hit the shelves.
Mhm. I'm like a little bit of like a hybrid process. So I will brainstorm probably in notebooks that are like littered all over the place. Can't keep track of which one I'm currently using. And I will jot down ideas or scenes or descriptions of the characters or the setting. And I'll do an outline. I'll type that up. I'll use like Word document and I'll do the outlines in there. And sometimes I'll start drafting in there as well. But I find like whenever I get stuck and then I take a break, I'll read a book I've read before or watch something completely different. But like a lot of times, journaling as a character in character or writing the scene from a different perspective, just like the act of handwriting it really helps me get out of my head sometimes. And it's like a little difficult sometimes to keep track of things, but I think I've gotten better of using the same notebook until the notebook is full and then putting that on the shelf and then starting a fresh one. I love starting a fresh book. It's so satisfying to know that you've completed something and you're starting something new. But yeah, I do a little bit of both, especially if I'm traveling a lot or I'm stuck. It just really helps to feel that pen and paper.
No, I get that 100%. I need you to know that you're like a rarity, that you actually finish a notebook before you start a new one. Like, that's
Mhm,
crazy. That's wild.
mhm,
But I also understand like 10,000% where you're coming from because I am very much a digital girly. I type faster than I handwrite. And so sometimes my thoughts, I'm like, my hand literally can't keep up. And so that's when I like switch to a keyboard, right?
mhm,
But I understand exactly what you mean when you're like, if you hit a slump or you hit a moment where you're like, I'm not sure where to go, is this the right perspective? And it's just kind of like a block, right?
mhm,
I understand that feeling when you switch to pen and paper and you're really just like locked in. It does something different to your brain. I can't tell you what it is. I'm not a scientist, but it really does something different to your brain when you're handwriting it out. I've noticed a difference even between using physical pen and paper versus using like a digital pen because I have like a remarkable that I like to use as well.
mhm,
But that's also a completely different thing. But I'll have to say that I agree with you. Like it's a very unique thing. And I feel like as an author, everybody kind of likes to go back to that original feeling that we kind of all enjoyed at some point of just being like, this is my pen, my paper, my imagination. There are no limits, you know?
mhm.
Especially when you can go outside the lines. I feel
Yeah.
like that's what I love about handwriting. When it's not like, oh, I need a backspace or delete. It's just like, oh, I can just grab a different color. Doo, 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 doo. Here we go. Right in the margins. And it's just like at the end, you can kind of see all of your thoughts on the page. And it's like, ah, this is kind of cool. This is kind
Mhm.
of fun.
It is. And then sometimes it dissolves into doodling in the margins, but that's okay because that's just also creativity, just, being released.
Exactly. It's part of the process. And I feel like if anyone is listening to this, I want them to understand that writing is a process, no matter what it may look like on the internet when you see people putting out the best parts of their process. Like, oh, I sat down with my nice mug of tea at my computer and I just locked in for 5 hours today and got all these words written. It's like, That's fantastic. That's probably not a daily occurrence. It's
Mhm.
process.
Yeah.
So,
I tell people not to be discouraged because what you see on the shelves in the bookstores, that is the tip of the iceberg. That is years and years of writing and researching, of like tossed out manuscripts. And it's like, don't be discouraged by looking at a finished product and thinking that your first effort isn't good enough.
absolutely. And I think a really good way to think about it too is like, if you see a movie in theaters,
Mhm.
it did not start out that way. It just started out as some raw film on a camera,
Yeah.
you know? So it's just kind of like you have to remember that there are a lot of bits and parts and moving aspects to this whole thing. So even if you're like, oh, I'm just writing, it's never just writing, right? It's a lot. But not gonna rant. I'm gonna keep us I'm gonna keep us focused. So tell us about the Davenports because you have the first book that was out. That was great, amazing,
Thank
super
you.
successful. And then you have book 2 that just came out last week, which is more than this. So,
Mhm.
like, and I say last week as of recording this because y'all listening to this are going to get this later, but it's out. So get into it. So tell us about that. Like, tell us about the Davenports and where you're at with that. And also, if book 2 is going to have a follow up book 3, maybe. I don't know. Let us know.
Yeah. So the Davenports takes place during what I believe is a forgotten time in history. It is about four young women growing up in Chicago in 1910 as they kind of grow into their own, fall in love, and decide whether or not society and their parental expectations are how they see themselves in their future. And it was inspired by a news article that I had read about C.R. Patterson. He was a gentleman that had escaped enslavement and started a carriage company, and his son later converted that into an automobile company. And the heading for the article was first and only African American owned automobile company in America. It's a very
Mm,
big mouthful, but like I was fascinated by that. I thought that was so interesting. And it was the type of thing that I would have loved to learn about in school. When I dug a little deeper into his background and the business, I found out that he had three daughters and that they had like very little information about them and their lives. And that was kind of the jumping off point for the Davenports. That was what I kind of centered my story about. And the four girls in the Davenports, they have different interests, but they're still all really supportive, strong friendships among the girls. And so Olivia, she is the firstborn. She is the firstborn daughter. She's very much trying to follow the path that her parents laid out for her until she meets a young lawyer from Alabama who opens her eyes up to the discrimination. And she starts to take notice of the Jim Crow legislature that's moving up north. And for her, at the start of book 2, which takes place 3 weeks after that, you see her take a more active role in what she believes is her calling to bring more awareness and see if she can enact some social justice change and kind of protect her family. She wants to protect her family and other people in her community. We have her best friend, Ruby, who is very much looking for a husband. She is in love with John Davenport, and she kind of uses a fake dating ruse to try and get his attention. But it ends up backfiring on her, and she falls in love with the wonderful Harrison Barton. And started book 2. She is in the beginning stages of planning for her wedding, and she's super excited. For Helen, she is Olivia's younger sister and the baby of the Davenport family. She is a little bit of a rebel. She takes being the baby and kind of getting her way a little too far, according to her parents, but for her, not far enough. She's very much interested in the family business and she wants to be a mechanic and be involved in bringing the Davenport Carriage Company into the new century and developing some automobiles with the help of her brother John. And then lastly, we have Amy Rose, who's a friend of theirs turned maid for the Davenport household. She is also in love with John, but like very much invested in creating her own hair care line. she is inspired by another figure in history that I read about, Madam C.J. Walker.
Hmm.
And yes, she's the first female millionaire. So it was like very inspiring to hear her story. So I really wanted to like bring elements of her accomplishments into the Davenports. And so like the young ladies are kind of like what I wish I had read as a teen growing up, learning about young women who looked like me and had challenges similar to mine, but like thriving in a time period where there's really a growth in the Black and Brown community. And yeah, it was just something that I wanted to be celebratory and fun, but not shy away from like what was really going on at that time.
I am excited for it because historical fiction in general, I think, has to tread a very careful line between
Mhm.
what you take liberty with and what you keep, true to reality. And, I like that you mentioned like incorporating the fact that, one of the characters is very much inspired by, Madam CJ Walker. Which, again, if you're listening to this podcast, hopefully you know who she is, but if you don't, for sure, go look her up because she had a very impressive life. I think they're making a movie about her life too,
Yeah.
as well.
I think there was a Netflix series about her as well. And I think it's just, I think it's great to see that success of a female entrepreneur, especially during this
Ab
time.
Absolutely. I feel like Madam CJ Walker is definitely up there with the Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, like, oh, that's definitely a name that should
Yes.
be in your lexicon, I'll say. But like I said, how do you make sure that you're not taking too much liberty with your historical fiction versus not letting what reality was kind of constrain the story that you're trying to tell? How do you balance that?
No, it's definitely a hard balance. I kind of looked at it as, especially through Olivia's eyes, because she comes from a place where she is sheltered. I felt like I was able to use her journey to kind of inform people. And having set in 1910, where there have been major milestones like the 1908 riots in Springfield, those are things that she would have known about, but maybe not had been old enough to really grasp what really happened. And I think having her be this new person who's learning about what's going on and having still Chicago be in a time period where there was an ability to thrive and look at what's going on in other states kind of from a safe distance really allowed me to have the characters still really enjoy being wealthy and going to parties, but then also like have that awareness of, okay, there are other things going on in the world. I want to be involved. I'm meeting other people from different perspectives and like just reminding people how important it is to like read papers and talk to people from different backgrounds who have different experiences because that only like makes you better. And yeah, it was definitely a balance that took rereading and being very like intent, like having a lot of intent on what I chose to keep in the story and like how I had the characters react to certain things that they learned.
That makes sense. I can
Yeah.
understand that. So that I guess it also makes me curious, because I've never tried my hand at historical fiction, mostly because I know the research is not for
Mhm.
me. I like making things up, so I stick with fantasy.
Yeah.
But would like to know what is your favorite part of writing historical fiction? But, not only that, but if anyone is listening and they're like, I've been curious about historical fiction, I guess what would be a stumbling block that you would tell them to be careful of getting into?
Yeah. So my favorite part was just learning about how people weren't really that different. I think the constraints, especially for society, like the young ladies had chaperones. They had to be very careful of being with gentlemen. They did have that pressure to always like follow what their parents say and like be really mindful of authority. But I think, that's something that we all learn like as you grow up is when to step out into your own, when to speak out. Like that, I thought that was very reassuring. One thing I would say was a stumbling block was mapping things out. So I was very
Mm.
lucky that the Chicago Public Library had so much of their archives online that was available. a lot of this novel was written during the pandemic, so I couldn't travel to Chicago until like most of it was done, or until it was done actually. And so looking at city maps and reading newspaper articles about different restaurants and finding their menus online, that was really cool for the big nerd in me to see menus and to see ads in newspapers. I found a Bloomingdale's magazine from 1910. I was like, oh, great. So now, like, I know how to style the girls because this is what was in Bloomies at the time. And like, it was like a lot of fun doing that research. And I think the hardest part was like figuring out the layout of buildings that probably no longer exist or the names that have changed. I spoke to some people who are Chicago natives and kind of instructed me on different things that like, oh, well, this is where this bank used to be and this used to be here. And these two locations are on opposite sides of the city. When I visited, I think not when I visited, but like before I finished like the final author pass pages for the novel, I realized that the field museum where Helen and Mr. Lawrence used to visit was at a different location. Like they had built a larger museum. So like figuring things out like that, that was kind of my stumbling blocks. But I mean, I think that when you write historical fiction, you do it for a love of the past and like curiosity. And I think if you tap into that passion, it really shines through the story.
I love that. And I
Mm.
feel like that's true for any type of writing that you do. Like if you're
Yeah.
really passionate about it and you love the story and you love the process and what it is that you're doing, like that's going to come through on the pages. And that's part of the reason why on the podcast and the YouTube channel and everything that I do, I'm always like, write the story because you love it and that's what you want to write and not because it's a trend or because it's popular or what someone tells you that you think you should write and all of this. Like you really have to have your own fuel behind the fire if you're really going to like put that into the story and keep it going. But that being said, I cannot have you on this podcast and not talk about the fact that the Davenports is getting an adaptation on Prime
Mhm.
Video. So, first of all, congratulations. That's
Thank
crazy
you.
exciting.
It
And
is.
also, like, what has that been like? Because I know that has to be somewhat surreal to like write this book during the pandemic. And now, 4 years later, it's going to be on Prime and
Mhm.
people are going to see it in a completely new medium and a new light. Like, what's that like?
It's so surreal. I did something that was a dare and then a hobby, and now it's this bigger thing than I could have ever imagined. I've been able to meet so many great people through it, and just to know that people are interested in it enough to make it into the series is crazy to me. I love that there is the chance for like even more people to see the story, and maybe that'll draw them to books and to more stories set in this time period or just in history in general. I think anytime we can have more positive representation out there is good for everyone. And I'm only curious to see the casting and the costumes. Like I am here for the costumes. Like I can't wait to see how they style all the characters. But yeah, I'm curious about the casting because I did not picture it real people when I described the characters. I kind of just made it up as I went along and then kept detailed notes so that I wouldn't confuse them later. So seeing who they cast as each of the characters, I think will be a lot of fun.
Do you have a fan cast?
I don't like, I have maybe people that I'm like, oh, that would be like a really handsome, like Harrison, or like, oh, this person kind of reminds me of John, but like, I, I haven't made a fan cast. I kind of hope for like new people and
Mm.
like they have an opportunity to like be in something and they're up and comers. Just like I was a new writer, they're like new actors. So it'll be interesting.
I'm excited for you. Do you know
Yeah.
if you'll get to be like how far behind the scenes you'll get to be? Like, will you get to meet the actors or do you know?
I think it's pretty early. I know they're doing a lot of pre-production behind the scenes stuff. So, and I've been able to meet some of the producers, which is great, but I
Which is great.
am excited to see what comes next and I'll share when I can. But yeah, the whole process is just so surreal.
I hope that it is a beautiful process and that you get a beautiful product out of it, that people love
Thank
it,
you.
and that it lends to people going to go get your books and everything else that it is that you write. Like, I am seriously over here rooting for you that it goes well.
Thank you.
But that being said, what is up next for you? Because you've got 2 books under your belts now. You've got the TV adaptation. I would be remiss not to mention that you also have the accolades of being an instant New York Times bestseller, as well as Kirkus Review's Best Book of the Year, and a couple of others that I don't have time to list. But you have met a lot of goals that a lot of authors have for themselves in their career. So what's coming up next for you? Do you have any other like big writing goals? Like, I want to accomplish this in my career. Like, do you have any of those left at this point?
I think I have a few left. I think that I just want to keep writing stories that people enjoy and connect with, things that I am proud of and I love, and that my mom loves. Like my mom is like my biggest cheerleader. So, having great stories to share with her who first got me into reading, I think will be great. I am working on a new historical fiction from multiple points of view. It's pretty early in the process, so I can't share too much. But yeah, I'm really excited to continue writing. And I think I also want to go back to my sci-fi roots, the books that really got me like really invested in storytelling and reading. So yeah, I think I'd like to try new genres and I don't know, just have fun. Yeah.
I love that. Have fun with your writing your career, because you did say that your first story that you ever wrote was like an X-Men fan fiction. So
Yes.
clearly it's in there.
Yeah.
But that being said, if anyone's listening to this and they're like, oh, I do want to go ahead and pick up the Davenports and more than this before the adaptation comes out, what would you say that you would want them to get from the book?
So what I would most want people to get from the book is following their passions. I think for each of the girls, they met with some barriers in trying to like find not only like love, but like what they wanted to do. And I think that, being true to yourself and believing in yourself and having that confidence can really open a lot of doors. And you'll find the people that should be in your life who will help and support you and guide you if you're true to yourself and you always try and follow your dreams.
Oh, that's so sweet.
Thank you.
It's so wholesome.
Yeah.
But that being said, my last question that I like to
Mhm.
ask everyone who comes on the podcast, which is, what writing advice would you give to any new authors who are just starting out on their writing journey?
I would say don't stop writing, even though I mean everyone has their writing clubs, but don't give up. If only you're the only person who reads it, or a family member, or your best friend, like holding that story inside of you, it's just so tough. And I would just say, like, don't give up. There's going to be a time where you're going to be so happy that you didn't stop and just keep writing. Yeah.
I believe Maya Angelou has a quote, and I'm probably going to butcher it because that's what I do. But I believe she's like, there is no greater burden than carrying an untold story inside of you. So absolutely, like, sit down, get it out. And I would also add to that there is no wrong way to write your story. So if that doesn't look like, okay, I'm sitting down with a pen and paper, it's like, grab your computer, grab your laptop, grab a old fashioned typewriter that you picked up secondhand from a
Mhm.
shop that does used typewriters, whatever, voice record it to and from your way to work, whatever way that you need to get that story out is valid. So don't let anyone like tell you like, oh, you're not a writer because you don't do X, Y, and Z, or you don't look a certain way or do a certain thing. If you are telling your story, if you are getting it out and you're doing it in the most authentic way possible that you know how to do, then you're a writer. Live in that. And welcome to the club. We have cookies and mental breakdowns on Tuesdays. So be prepared. But that being said, Krystal, if you could let the people know where you are on the interwebs, I will go ahead and take us out.
Yes. So you can find me on my website at krystalmarquis.com and on Instagram and Threads at Christabel_reads.
So you guys know that there will be a link to all the things down in the description box or the show notes, depending on where you are listening to this at. And that is it for this episode of the Written in Melanin podcast, you guys. If you'd like to support this podcast, then please share it with someone you think may enjoy it. Join the Patreon at patreon.com/written in melanin. Grab a copy of my books from my website, cmlockhart.com, or donate to the podcast so that we can continue making content for you guys. There are links in the show notes/description box for everything. And thank you guys again so much for listening. Until next time, I hope all your books are full of melanin.